It would only be natural to follow up a video about revs with the other great Geoff Crammond racing game which could be found on 8-bit micros, Stunt Car Racer, or Stunt Track Racer if you've decided to go and live on the other side of a big sea or something. Which is why I'm only doing this, because it turned out my original planned video, nothing to do with Geoff Crammond or racing games, happened to need a location shot which I'm not going to have chance to get in time. Besides which, this is not a solely 8-bit story, it concerns the PC as well. One of the frustrations of being a PC owner in the early 90s, one of, well, many, was the feeling of getting a port that didn't make the most of your machine. I know, it doesn't feel like there's a lot of most that you can get out of a 286 and 1 megabyte of RAM, but look, once you've seen and heard it play Wolfenstein 3D, you're going to be at least a little disappointed when the next game you put into it fires up in CGA with an unwelcome swan-like honking from the resolutely PC speaker-only soundtrack. At which point, I'm going to leave that whole storyline hanging and show you Stunt Car Racer on the Amiga. On a basic A500, this is making the most of the machine, at least once you're past the sparse menus. The flat-shaded polygon graphics give the tracks a feeling of solidity, the draw distance is great, and you're all going to agree that it all moves fluidly, or I'm going to give you that lecture about vintage frame rates again. Maybe the engine sound is a little lacking, but there are some satisfying creaks when the suspension bottoms out and some wonderfully crunchy crash sounds. The game itself is a tournament structure, played out over 4 divisions, each with 2 tracks apiece. Each division contains 3 drivers, and for whichever one you're in, you race each other driver twice, once per track. Points are awarded for coming first, and also for getting the fastest lap in the race. The driver with the most points after all races goes up a division, and the one with the least is demoted to make room for them. Win Division 1 and you'll be promoted to a Super League, with faster cars and faster opponents to make things rather more difficult. All of which is me describing the game without paying any attention to the important bit, the driving. Stunt Car Racer is, unexpectedly, a game about going no faster than you need to. While having a limited supply of booster fuel might seem like the main thing to worry about, the bigger problem is having a limited supply of places in which to use it. Measure out that source a little too eagerly and you'll be zooming off the brow of hills, bouncing off the outside edge of those elevated corners and smacking into the flat ground on the far side of a jump, rather than gently buttering an opposite ramp. The problem with letting things go a bit too Evel Knievel isn't just the time lost to being craned back on track, as Stunt Car Racer features 2 types of damage: cracks, which move from left to right over the course of a race, and holes, which are permanent for your entire tournament career, unless you get demoted back to Division 4, at which point the game takes pity on you and repairs them. Cracks advance faster through holes, and if a crack gets all the way to the right-hand side of the screen, then your car is wrecked and your race is over. Yes, even though the crack is in the roof, and in theory all that should have happened at this point is you've just made yourself one mean convertible. As a result of this enforced roof having, the game is less about charging around with abandon, as it is holding back and making judicious choices on when to use the throttle pedal. A fair criticism of Stunt Car Racer is that most of the circuits involve memorising the correct speed and setup sequence for each circuit's big set-piece stunt, with the actual racing taking place only on the small sections of track where nothing much happens. But then again, you could also level the same criticism at most of the later maps in Trackmania Nations Forever, and that only happens to be one of the most addictive games ever. The need for not so much speed certainly didn't prevent Stunt Car Racer launching to fantastic press in December 1989, continuing into early 1990. with Amiga magazines falling over themselves to give the game scores in the high 80 or low 90% range, or, in the case of Amiga computing, a full marks 100%, although it is worth noting that particular magazine tended to play a bit fast and loose with the ideas of both out of 100 and which games those out of range scores would go to. If you want to know more about such things and the magazine reviews of the past, you should know where to go by now. It starts with Yester and ends in Zine. Part of this was that Amiga magazines would inevitably have more than one Amiga on hand, because having 0 was a bit useless for reviewing Amiga games, and having just one would be a bit of a production bottleneck for a magazine which needs to review many games. And Stunt Car Racer featured a link-up system, which allowed you to connect two computers, say Amigas, with a serial cable and race a human opponent. In a surprisingly prescient move, this allowed crossplay between both Amiga and Atari ST versions. Consider that linked multiplayer itself was still an exciting novelty in 1989, let alone being able to do it across platforms. Also falling over themselves to give the latest Geoff Crammond game rave reviews in December 1989 were Commodore 64 magazines. The C64 had what was considered to be an excellent port of a game considered good on the 16-bit systems, let alone what by this point were rather aging 8-bit ones. It did give up the distinct polygons for a rather more monochrome approach, but this does mean the C64 version is fast and fluid, even if the colours are rather more garish or occasionally, yes, if I don't say it, someone else will, so I may as well get it out of the way now, brown. What is slightly surprising is that all 3 of these ports were, as far as I can tell, released at about the same time, and all 3 were programmed by Geoff Crammond himself. As ever, the internet makes this exceptionally murky, but several C64 reviews tend to mention the Amiga version as having been released earlier, and the box art uses screenshots from the ST version, whereas the Amiga and ST boxes do not mention the availability of the game on any other platform, let alone show screenshots from it. Whether this points to the 8-bit version releasing a couple of weeks later, or merely Microprose's Micropay label simply doing the box art and getting press copies out earlier for the 16-bit versions, I'm not sure. This lack of certainty gets even murkier when Geoff Crammond himself mentions that most of the early development of what would become Stunt Car Racer was indeed done on the C64, because he started on it shortly after finishing Revs. So, in development terms, the C64 version was likely the original, even if the Amiga port was the first to land in the postboxes of the review magazines. Stunt Car Racer may seem like an oddity looking back at what we know now of Geoff Crammond's career. It does not simulate a real-life motor racing series with formula in the name, and it does not include real-life circuits. It does not even include circuits which might plausibly be built in real life, unless someone particularly wanted to break their car, their skeleton, or perhaps both in one hit when it comes to taking the ski jump at anything other than 210 km per hour. But as of 1985, Crammond did not have that long history of serious motor racing games. Indeed, at the time he admitted to not having any particular interest in motor racing at all, with Acornsoft only commissioning a Formula 3 game because they had recently sponsored a Formula 3 team. He started to gain an interest after working with said racing team on the car specifications, studying tyre modelling, and perhaps also being driven around Thruxton at high speed in what was at the time a brand new BMW but is most likely now a pile of rusting metal in a scrapyard somewhere. This latter experience, including looking at the rather worn state of the tyres afterward, made him think, maybe I get the appeal of this now. While he may have seen the appeal of going sideways very fast while someone else picks up the bill for new tyres, Crammond's games at this point were still quite varied. There was Super Invaders, a Space Invaders clone, Aviator, a flight sim, Revs, as discussed in this very channel previously, and then his next game would be a 3D puzzle game called The Sentinel. And after that, he planned a kind of alien planet roving simulation where you would drive a buggy around a large surface covered in lumps and bumps. This kind of serendipitous approach, where you just start coding whatever you feel like and see where it goes, may seem odd to us in a world where games are planned, market research is done, and budgets are locked in before so much as a line of code is written. But with cheap software, low royalties, and short production cycles, the 80s was the age of the bedroom coder. Either a teenager who had no need of a real job, or someone like Crammond who initially made games in his spare time while having a full-time day job at Marconi. However, Crammond could see that with games becoming increasingly popular, it would be possible to make a living working on them full-time, and so, when Acornsoft offered him the Revs contract, he left behind more mundane work to join the exciting world of shredding tyres and then coding detailed physical simulations of exactly how those tyres came to be shod. The problem with this lack of backup income was that while Revs launched the concept of the Sim Racer and follow-up The Sentinel was an acclaimed game ported to multiple platforms, his follow-up roving simulation just wasn't much fun. It had an advanced and clever suspension system to model the reaction of the buggy to driving over the various protrusions and knobbly bits of the landscape, but doing this at slow speed offered limited fun for anybody who didn't like watching physics models do their thing. Crammond found it was far more fun to hold down the accelerator, aim at the first lump you could find, and go flying into the air, then watch the modelled suspension bobble around upon landing. To make this unsanctioned fun a little easier to discover, he started arranging lumps, bumps, and even jumps into track-like structures. Driving around these was even more fun, and the roving game instead became a recognisable ancestor of Stunt Car Racer. All of which may explain Stunt Car Racer's interesting but also rather odd physics system. The driving model itself is quite simple. If the wheels are on the track, the car rotates left or right a certain amount each frame when the steering key is pressed. More if you are going faster, more if you are steering in the correct direction for a bend, and less if you're steering in the wrong direction. The car also tries to align itself with the track direction, although this effect isn't strong enough you can ignore the steering altogether except at very low speeds. Which low speeds are not going to be winning races or indeed even getting over any jumps. It's that wheels on the track bit where things get a bit involved. Stunt Car Racer has a 3-point suspension system. 1 point for the front left wheel, 1 point for the front right, and a single point representing both rear wheels. Apparently, the stunt car itself is a Morgan freewheeler. This tricycling approach gives a good approximation of both pitch and roll dynamics, while cutting down the number of expensive track-wheel intersection calculations needed. In normal driving, gravity trying to accelerate the car down is balanced by the force of each suspension point pushing it back up. Drive off a ramp or go over a hill too fast and the track falls away faster than gravity accelerates the car downward, with the game showing the suspension drooping in response. A hard landing or driving too fast into an upward ramp has the opposite effect. The suspension can't push the car away from the track quick enough, and it bottoms out. This is how the game applies damage, which is why you can sometimes get away with outrageous things if the suspension model didn't pick them up. With so much verticality in the tracks, it's this suspension model which drives much of your interaction with the game, rather than the relatively simple steering, acceleration, and braking. It makes Stunt Car Racer quite unique, especially for its time, and feels pleasingly weighty to interact with. It's not a true 3D model, as there are limits to how much the car is allowed to pitch or roll. But for the officially sanctioned stunts and all but the wildest crashes, you won't run into those limits, making this all feel quite realistic. The tracks themselves use a variation of the track segment approach seen in Revs, requesting more polygons as they are needed. Other than the fine detail popping in, this isn't too noticeable on the Amiga with its long draw distance, but that is not the only version of the game. Already mentioned, we have the two 16-bit versions, Amiga and Atari ST, and the less colourful but still very playable Commodore 64 version. Extending further into the world of the 8-bit micros, Pete Cook created ports to two Z80 base machines, the ZX Spectrum and Amstrad CPC. If you were being uncharitable, you would compare this to the C64 version and call them a demake of something that already looked like a bit of a demake. But they are impressive in their own right in terms of getting a lot out of some very limited platforms. I'd certainly rather play this than the spectrum of CPC versions of Hard Driving, on the basis that they're both enjoyable and, unlike the latter, don't have a control scheme which makes you want to give up, go outside, lie down near a big pond and wait until you're consumed by wild geese. Then we have the PC port. This was programmed by Tim Ansell, and further delve into the confusing world of exactly what got released when suggests it also hit the market in December 1989. In fact, Period magazine advertising suggests all versions appear to have been released near simultaneously, ready for the tail end of the Christmas rush, with the exception of the Amstrad CPC version, which followed in 1990. You might reasonably expect that a few weeks shy of 1990, the PC version would look much akin to the Amiga and Atari versions, perhaps using the additional processor muscle of a fast 286 or 386 to give higher frame rates at the trade-off of a rather less crunchy ad-lib rendered soundtrack, state of the art for 1989 on the PC. This is certainly what I expected, buying a budget re-release of the game having played it on friends' Amigas and STs. What I did not notice was this screenshot on the box. The PC version of Stunt Car Racer looks like this. What was it I was saying about the frustrations of being a PC owner in the early 1990s? This is not just that it targets EGA as a graphic standard. If I load a screenshot of PC Stunt Car Racer into Deluxe Paint, explicitly using an EGA graphics mode with the standard palette, you can see after some crude alteration it would be entirely possible for this to have looked not dissimilar to the other 16-bit versions. However, this makes a lot more sense if you consider PC Stunt Car Racer as a direct port of the C64 version. And I suspect this is what happened. With microprose targeting a simultaneous release across multiple platforms, Tim Ansell may have been working based on the C64 codebase while Crammond ported his own game to the Motorola 68000 based computers, adding extra graphical polish as he did so. Also, while the very end of 1989 is a little late for it to happen, there was an ethos which pervaded PC gaming for most of the 80s, which was that any game you bought should be able to run on an original IBM 5150 with a CGA graphics card from 1981. This may seem odd, given the following 2.5 decades were marked by a top-of-the-line PC becoming totally obsolete within 3 or 4 years, but I think this points to how small the PC gaming market was before the explosion in home desktop computer ownership in the wake of both Windows 95 and increasingly affordable prices for Pentium-class CPUs. That doesn't stop buying a budget release of the game in the early 90s and getting it home being a bit of a disappointment, graphics-wise. Thankfully, the gameplay is still there. Perhaps more of it. While the PC version doesn't look like much, or indeed sound like much, thanks to its PC speaker-only sound effects, it is exceptionally fluid and responsive. I played this all through the 486 era, right up until the point I upgraded to a motherboard which no longer supported my 5¼ disk drive, at which point, inability to circumvent the on-disk copy protection defeated me. Sadly, there was no enhanced version of Stunt Car Racer, and Even the Amiga version does not benefit much from being run on later, faster machines. There were rumours of an Atari Jaguar port in the works in the mid-90s, but, well, the entire Atari Jaguar saga happened, leaving Club Drive on that platform as the single greatest racing game ever developed. A perfect experience. Crammond himself returned to the idea of Stunt Car Racing in the early 2000s for a sequel entitled, imaginatively, Stunt Car Racer Pro, which got as far as early game engine demos before developer Lost Toys folded, taking the game with it. This appears to be a consistent curse of attempts to remake Stunt Car Racer, with modern fan reimagining Stunt Car Mania seemingly in limbo as of 2022, and while there is a Windows remake implementing authentic driving mechanics and graphics with the original tracks, it leaves the tournament and therefore most of the game part of the game consigned to history. Of all things to have been completed, there's a modern BBC Micro port of the C64 version which, if nothing else, brings Stunt Car Racer back to the original home of Geoff Crammond racing games. Further searching turns up the occasional work-in-progress Unity project or retro-inspired mobile game, but listing every started project on the internet is a fool's errand. And every time I look at a tablet someone uses for gaming, it appears to have a billion near-identical games installed on it, so while I'm sure there's enough monkey typewriter effect going on that at least one of them is going to be superficially similar to Stunt Car Racer, I am not going to look. Besides which, if you were looking less for an official sequel and more a spiritual one which combines the same elements of plausible physics, high-speed action, ludicrous stunts, addictive multiplayer, and, of course, the careful memorization of each track's set pieces, there are many Trackmania games, at least one of which is free and, probably by this point, even notionally retro. This is probably going to start an argument about the time trial-focused nature and puzzle-based gameplay elements of said game, but I don't care. Trackmania Nations Forever is brilliant, and it deserves mentioning twice. Although if you do find yourself still pining for those red and white track borders and imminent suspension damage, you can download a version of the Little Ramp track for Assetto Corsa, and finally feel like that expensive graphics card and dust-gathering VR headset are actually being made use of. Ideal if you really were disappointed by the original game's refusal to let you drive around it in a convertible. Stunt Car Racer may seem like an oddity looking back at what we know of Geoff Crammond, the man who did lots of tram simulations.